Why Media Group? The fastest growing media group in North America.
And welcome to Why Media Newsroom. I'm Ramona Singh, and we have a great show for you today as we bring you the latest international, national, and local headlines shaping our world. Well, today we begin with the latest development in the United States, Israel, and Iran conflict. Diplomacy hangs in the balance as tension remains high across the Middle East. Peace talks appear stalled, and new clashes are reported in Lebanon as things escalate there. And we're watching that very closely. Meanwhile, a rare bipartisan vote in Washington has delivered a political shockwave. If you believe it, the U.S. House has moved to limit President Trump's war powers over Iran, promoting and prompting a sharp response from the president himself, saying that they are not being patriotic. We're going to cover the details for you. And back here at home, Prime Minister Mark Carney unveiled Canada's ambitious AI strategy, promising thousands of jobs and billions of dollars in investment. Critics, however, are saying that whether Ottawa is moving too quickly without adequate safeguards and whether Canadians are prepared for the economic and workforce disruptions that AI may bring with itself. And also to examine why some economists may say that high immigration helped mask deeper weaknesses in Canada's economy. That is the latest update when we've first heard that Canada is in a technical recession and what could have been behind it. We're going to go into those details. And on another story is that we're going to cover in terms of what Ontario's doing as it's launched a major crackdown on ticket scalping ahead of FIFA World Cup and what it means for scalpers and the big fine that is attached to it. All this and much more on today's Why Media Newsroom. So starting with the top news that we've been watching for, almost now 2.5 months, well, leading to almost 3 months, is this entire conflict with the US, Israel, and Iran, which has affected GCC countries as of late, Kuwait, as you saw, and Lebanon. And so the US brokered a ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon and is facing major obstacles only days after it was announced, while the government of Israel and Lebanon have agreed technically to a framework that would see Lebanese military take control of parts of southern Lebanon and reduce Hezbollah's presence. Hezbollah themselves are saying that it's not part of the negotiations, and because it's not at the table, it rejects the deal. And the fighting and airstrikes and cross-border attacks have continued, raising doubt about whether the ceasefire could hold. The biggest challenge here is that whether the three key players have different goals. You have Israel that wants Hezbollah pushed back and disarmed. You have Lebanon that wants a ceasefire and of all hostilities and restoration of its sovereignty. And then you have Hezbollah that's insisting that it will continue resisting until Israeli forces fully withdraw from the Lebanese territory. And that is what's taking place. And so what are the exact measurements? Well, you have Israel currently controls approximately 600 square kilometers of a territory in southern Lebanon, and they're calling it a security buffer zone, but essentially it's an occupation in Lebanon. It's in Lebanon's territory. It's in southern Lebanon, so that's 600 square kilometers. More than 3,500 people have been killed so far in Lebanon during this conflict, and approximately 1.2 million people have been displaced, having to leave their homes in southern Lebanon because of the occupation that's been taking place. And the hostilities and the attacks and the bombing. So you have, over 1.2 million people homeless right now in Lebanon, having to flee their own homes. And so now this original U.S. brokered ceasefire was announced. If you remember back in April, it was supposed to be a 10-day truce, and then repeated violations from both sides of Hezbollah and Israel just undermined the entire truce. But now you have Israel and Lebanon that are scheduled to resume negotiations during the last week of June, of the month of June, on June 22nd, in an effort to reach broader settlement. So now the ceasefire's biggest weakness is that it was negotiated between governments, while the main fighting force on the Lebanese side, you have Hezbollah, which is fighting to push out the Israelis out of Lebanon, was not part of the agreement. And to that, if Hezbollah is not going to agree to the ceasefire, then the Lebanese government is not able to do anything about it. So therefore, it's a ceasefire in terms of an idea, but the practicality of it is what we're seeing play out, the reality of it continuing. And Israel wants security guarantees before withdrawing. They're saying Hezbollah wants withdrawals before ending its military operation. Lebanon's government is caught in this middle of trying to regain authority over its territory where Hezbollah remains influential and also regain its territory over where the Israeli soldiers are. So Lebanon is in a place where it's having to deal with war, and the Lebanese people have been, under duress in this war situation, and many displaced. So this tension is ongoing, and this of course affects the peace deal with Iran in terms of getting to a place. You have what this looks like is, we announced yesterday that Kuwait airport was struck by Iranian forces, and it killed one person and it injured over 60 people. So you have this standoff between Iran and US, and that happened after US targeted Iran. And so in the ceasefire situation, you still have escalations that are happening with US and Iran, and the fallout of that is in GCC countries, and in this case, it's in Kuwait. So it's continuously changing, and there is no peace deal yet. This war, this conflict, I mean, let's call it a war, we've entered into day 96. So the 100-day mark is right around the corner. And because of this recent escalation, well, you had the US House essentially say, hey, Trump said there wasn't an escalation. We're in a ceasefire, so he didn't need permission from Congress. And because of this recent escalation that took place, now Congress is getting involved, right? So the initial attack started with US and Israel on February 28th. If you recall, that was when Ayatollah Khamenei was killed, as well as high-ranking officials in the Iranian regime. That essentially launched a 30-day war, actually 40-day war that continued, which we've never seen before, with the escalations and many GCC countries being attacked in response, as well as Israel. And then at the same time, early March, you had the Israeli forces go into southern Lebanon because they said it's a buffer zone because of the Hezbollah attacks. So all this is taking place. And, 2 days ago, you had US forces, conducted what CENTCOM described as a self-defense strike against Iran's targets. And therefore, you had Iran and US continue to exchange attacks despite repeated ceasefire discussions. What's at risk on top of lives lost and many millions of people displaced is the Strait of Hormuz, which is the 20% of the energy corridor of the world. And that is what people are watching. So now this shock bipartisan vote to stop Trump's abilities on this war. You had 4 Republicans who joined the Democrats in passing a House War Powers resolution. That's very significant because, so far you've had the Republicans really back their president, seeing that if you go against the president goes against you, you could potentially lose your seat and not be a politician, have to step out. We've seen that happen with many Republican politicians up to now. So for them to stand up and oppose President Trump's war powers over the conflict in Iran is very significant. To that, President Trump called them unpatriotic as a response, right? So now this big story isn't just about military exchanges of what we're hearing. It's this gap between what we're seeing, diplomacy of them constantly calling it a ceasefire, but the reality of it is a war that continues between all of these nations at the same time. And perhaps part of the challenge is that the United States is trying to do a deal with Iran, yet it entered the war with Israel. And Israel is going to do what it needs to do when it comes to their own objectives in southern Lebanon, with their own objectives of Iran and what they believe in terms of the enriched uranium Iran still has in their possessions and what would be a nuclear program and wanting to dismantle all those nuclear facility sites, right? So Israel has its own objectives. So when Israel's not at the table to have these peace deals that Iran and the United States are trying to do, then it makes it very difficult when Israel continues having its bombardments and its strikes with Hezbollah and the clashes in southern Lebanon. That gets all tied into this deal that gets staled, right? But had it been just the United States without Israel, maybe things would have been a bit different. Or if it was Israel and the United States never got involved, which the United States usually gets involved. But that is kind of where it all differs, right? Where you can't really have all the same people at the table, and therefore everyone is reaching out to their own objectives. Like in the case of you have Lebanon and Israel saying, yeah, we're gonna have a ceasefire. Hezbollah saying we're not at the table and we disagree. And this is what we're seeing take over consistently when it comes to this conflict with Iran. Now, moving on to domestic policy, we have Prime Minister Mark Carney, who unveiled Canada's longest awaited national AI strategy, positioning AI as what he called a cornerstone of economic growth, productivity, and job creations. He said that this AI strategy in Canada will create thousands of jobs, invest in Canadian AI companies, what it would be in terms of expanding digital infrastructure and provide AI training for workers. This is part of a strategy where he said that, by 2031, he's saying that, there will be many jobs created when it comes to the Canadian workforce, creating up to 90,000 AI-related jobs, work opportunities for young Canadians, support creating up to 250,000 new jobs through AI adoption, and saying that it's going to boost Canada's business adoption of AI from 12% today to more than 50% by 2030. So very, big marks. 2030 is where, and he said he's going to also increase the GDP spending for, becoming a NATO member and defense from 2% to 4%. So this 2030 mark, having, this boost from AI when it comes to the workforce, but it also means more spending going towards defense, which he is committing to. So lots of new things. There's many numbers that they've put out from the AI minister, as well as, making all these rounds of announcements, Evan Solomon for the past few weeks. If we calculate it, we're looking at over $2.5 billion of investment based on, $700 million here, $300 million there. There's a lot of investments we're looking at that the government's doing with tax dollars. And for that, they're saying that that's supposed to, create jobs and to make sure Canada's competitive. And when it comes to the global AI spending, it's expected to exceed $1 trillion annually within the next decade through, according to industry forecasts. So Canada wants to be a part of all of that. So for years, um, the thing is, Canada's challenge has never been whether it's about AI, because Canada's been a big part of being part of inventing AI, right? It's just Canada's issue has been how Canada would monetize on AI, right? So you have Canadian universities that produced groundbreaking AI research, yet many of the economic benefits flowed to foreign technology giants in the United States or in China or elsewhere. So you have Prime Minister Mark Carney saying, here's a strategy to essentially, bet that Canada can finally capture more of the value created through innovation, keep some of those, inventors, early people who have contributed to AI to stay in Canada to produce Canadian jobs. So this opportunity is enormous, of course, and Canada's economy has struggled with weak productivity growth for nearly 2 decades now. And if AI can help businesses produce more of the same workforce, it could become one of the most important economic reforms of this generation. But then there's always the question of how many job losses will it also have? And can it train people who experience job losses because of AI efficiencies and investments for them to be retrained and to go to have jobs? So that's all part of what we're talking about. We did a really great roundtable earlier today with Group Editor Udvir G, and then we have Imran, who's actually she has her master's in AI, and we did a nice roundtable talking about what does it mean. So definitely look into that as well. But what I want to do is I want to take a look at AI and what does it mean when it comes to the environment, when it comes to health and safety of human beings, right? So when you look at the energy consumptions, AI requires enormous computing powers, right? A large AI data center can consume as much electricity as a small city, right? And there's this mass speed towards having data centers, and you have Alberta who's saying we're going to have data centers. You have Ontario who's vying for it. You have Quebec and all of the same. So when it comes to what does it take to have AI data centers and what is the environmental implications? Because there's going to be increased demand for electricity. We had Prime Minister Mark Carney talk about doubling the electrical grid by 50% in a short period of time. But then you have all of that. So you have more fossil fuel generation if renewable energy is unavailable. You have higher greenhouse gas emissions. You have pressure on the electrical grid. And when it comes to the human health impact, you got to take a look at indirectly, what is that impact, right? Is there going to be air pollution from natural gas or coal power plants? Is there going to be an issue for Canadians having an increase rates of being exposed to that? And for the last little while, we were told don't take your phone into next to your bed, right? Because it emits and you need to stay away from it. So leave it outside of your room. Or they say, don't take a look at the screen on your phone because, the lights will, throw off your entire rhythm. And so we've had all sorts of warnings, right? Don't use a microwave, or don't use this. This is unsafe. That's unsafe. So my question really is, maybe some of them are not true. Maybe some of them have some truth to it. But what does it mean to live around an AI center? Will that have an impact on the health of the community? And then you got to look at, what does it really take to run a data center, right? So data centers generate enormous heat. So water usage is very significant. Why? Because of cooling servers, cooling towers, air conditioning systems, so things don't overheat. So a large AI center can use millions of liters of water per day. So what does that mean in terms of environmental impact? The depletion on local water supplies, when it comes to competing for agriculture and residential use, and the stress on drought-prone regions that other parts of the world experience. So this is very significant in terms of what does it mean to have massive data centers all over the place? And then there's a question of the electronic waste, right? We know that AI hardware becomes obsolete very quickly as technology moves. So when you have components of GPUs, servers, semiconductors, batteries, and cooling systems, is that going to go to the trash yard? And when it comes to environmental impact, what does that mean for toxic waste disposal of those components? And then there's a critical thing of mining rare earth minerals to be able to support it, right? You have heavy metals entering the soil and water. That could be exposure to lead, mercury, arsenic. So these are significant things of how would that impact the human health. And when it comes to actual natural resources that you need to mine for AI hardware, you do need lithium, you do need cobalt, you need nickel, you need copper and rare earth elements to be able to, be able to supply this AI revolution of data centers. So it's a lot of things to take into consideration and beware of if there is an AI data center coming, to a place near where you live, as we've seen a lot of protests take place with communities that don't want these AI centers to come near them. So this is of high concern, and there's the balance of, AI itself is not inherently harmful to human health, right? But when you take a look at what it means in terms of what the infrastructure requires to power it with electricity generators, water consumption, mining, e-waste, air pollution, noise, land use, you have to take into consideration what that means for communities that have to live near an AI center. And so that's all part of the discussion, aside from all the investments that we're looking at for Prime Minister Mark Carney. Now, another things that you see, that's an image. We had Shubi, who was there in person, and he asked a few questions. But what I do want to take you to is that Prime Minister Mark Carney also met with Barbados, the Prime Minister of Barbados, as well as the Prime Minister of Grenada today, to talk about diplomatic and travel updates. There is, a lot of cooperation that Canada has with the Caribbean countries when it comes to Grenada. Prime Minister Dixon Mitchell traveled to Canada for an official visit, and this is going to be part of high-level bilateral discussions with the Prime Minister. And the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, also visiting Prime Minister today for a working lunch on discussing bilateral relations. We have images and videos. We had our Y Media people there, to see this visitation from the prime ministers in the Caribbean countries. But, just to be able to highlight what this means, right? Canada has worked very closely in bilateral relations with Canada and CARICOM, which is a strategic partnership and trade expansion between Canada and the Europe and the Caribbean countries. And part of that is Prime Minister Mark Carney has previously emphasized partnering with Barbados and Caribbean delegations to bring lasting security and stability in the region when it comes to Haiti and regional issues. For Barbados, what's significant there is that there's been a relationship, an established diplomatic relationship between Canada and Barbados for about 60 years. It dates back to 1966. Since Barbados' independence, and more than 31,000 Barbadian Canadians live in Canada. You have this is very significant because in 2023, Canadian exports to Barbados totaled $47.2 million, while imports from Barbados reached $23.3 million. So this is a close relationship that we have with our Caribbean partners. But on another thing, today, when Prime Minister Mark Carney unveiled his AI strategy, we had our host Shubi there in person, and he was, there asking questions from the Prime Minister, and more specifically when it comes to Bill C9, which is officially known as Combating Hate Act, proposed by, the Parliament, designed to amend criminal code to address the rise in hate-motivated crimes and propaganda. Well, to that, there's several key changes that has been proposed, which is creating new offenses, making it a crime to intentionally intimidate or obstruct people from accessing places of worship, schools, daycare centers, and senior residence and community centers. Banning all hate symbols, which would be prohibiting the willful public display of symbols associated with terrorist entities, recognizing hate groups, like, for example, Nazi swastikas, right? And what would be for, all of that. And then you have the terms of defining hate. What's been added under this new statutory is adding a statutory definition of hatred to the criminal code, establishing as an intense emotional associated with vilification and detestation, moving beyond mere disdain. Very significant terms there. And specific hate crime offenses, which is establishing a standalone hate crime offense to establish harsher penalties for any act motivated by hatred based on race, religion, sexual orientation, disability, or other protected characteristics. So the prosecution changes here are to remove the requirements that the Attorney General must consent before laying hate propaganda charges. So now, why has this been controversial? Right? This has been controversial because this bill is strongly backed by victims and human rights advocates, sure, on some of these things, right? But it's also sparked a very significant debate because critics are saying that, like civil liberties organizations and labor groups are saying that they're arguing that this legislation has very broad language and it could be used to criminalize maybe peaceful protests. Right? What are protests for? They're protesting something, right? That would be peaceful. As Canadians, we have the right to a peaceful protest. And then there's also some criticism that will it erode freedom of expression? Should I be entitled to my beliefs and be able to express it? Is that not a fundamental human right as long as it doesn't have, hate crime associated to it? And what would be disproportionately, it would affect some of these communities, right? So, like, for example, you have faith-based organizations or some advocacy groups that are concerned and have expressed their concerns over these amendments, saying that remove or the alter of the good faith is in religious defense regarding hate propaganda could really put you in a hot seat, right? So you have this situation where you have Bill C9, where it's trying to solve a problem that we've seen, right? We've seen an uptick of some criminalization against certain minority groups, right? So Canada has seen a sharp rise in hate crimes, anti-Semitic incidents, attacks on places of worship, intimidation targeting certain religious or cultural communities, but creating stronger protections for people, right, who can get access to whether it's a mosque or a synagogue, church or school or community center is difficult to oppose. I mean, we want people to be able to go and pray where they need to be, right, with their community. But the creation of a standalone hate crime offense and having these kind of a generalized terms, definitions around hatred may also give police and court tools to deal with what could be, hate motivated crime. But the issue here is that some of these parts of the bill move into the territory of touching fundamental freedoms, right? The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms gives you the ability to have peaceful protest. It gives you the ability to, have freedom of expression, freedom of thought, freedom of speech, freedom of, of religious expression. It gives you those rights. So now civil liberties organizations are saying, what does this mean, right? When it comes to portions of this legislation that could unintendedly have consequences for free expression, peaceful protest and religious speech, right? So what's good is it's going to protect places of worship. We need that. We need people to feel safe when they go to a place of worship. It can target intimidation and hate motivated violence. Of course, we want people to be safe. It's going to ban public display of certain hate symbols. Yeah, we don't need to see, a swastika on a wall being sprayed. It's going to recognize hate crimes that are, that deserve penalties, that is to target specific groups of people. But then you have the concerns of removing the Attorney General's approval required could make the prosecution easier and may reduce very important safeguards of what is hate speech or or intimidation and what is just freedom of expression. The removal of the good faith religious defense has raised concerns among some religious groups that they say that this legitimizes religious beliefs that could become subject to complaints or legal scrutiny here in Canada. And critics fear that broad language around intimidation or obstruction could potentially be used against peaceful protests in some of these circumstances. So what do we want? In a democracy, of course, we want to be able to do two things at the same time. One being that we want to protect people from hate, threat, intimidation, and violence. The second thing is we also want to be able to have, peaceful protests, to protect our freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and to be able to have those expressions as I do on this many, many times. I tell you how I feel about certain things. So the strongest version of Bill C9 could aggressively target actual hate crime and intimidation while including clear safeguards and ensuring Canadians cannot be prosecuted simply for expressing maybe unpopular opinion, maybe opinion that, may upset or offend some people, that they think is very unpopular, or maybe it means engaging in a peaceful protest outside of a concert, for example, which, it's or outside of the legislature or outside of places where they oppose, what is taking place, or to be able to discuss religious beliefs in good faith. So these are all really important parts of what's taking place right now. And we have the clips of our co-hosts should be, on the ground asking the Prime Minister some of these questions, which we've covered for you, and you'll be able to see that on our social medias. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back.